The United States has kept some of its treaties, just not with everyone. In 1783, America signed a peace deal with Britain and honored it completely. In 1868, America signed a deal with the Lakota and broke it in 6 years. Same government, same constitutional system, radically different outcomes. The question is not whether treaties were broken, it is why some were kept and others were not. Let's start with a date most Americans learned in school, September 3, 1783. That is the day the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally ending the Revolutionary War. Britain recognized American sovereignty, withdrew its forces, and released prisoners. The United States met its obligations too. Borders were honored. Terms were fulfilled. That treaty held. It is still the legal foundation of American territorial sovereignty today. Now hold that fact in your mind, because we are going to need it. 85 years later, the same government sat down at another table. This time, the table was at Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory. The date was April 29, 1868. Across that table sat leaders of the Lakota Nation, among them Spotted Tail and Man Afraid of His Horses. U.S. commissioners placed a 15-page document between them. The document was read aloud, translated, and signed. Article 2 used language that could not be misread. Set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux Nation. That language is still in the National Archives. Record Group 75. The ink dried. The deal was made. The Great Sioux Reservation, including the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, belonged to the Lakota. The reservation covered roughly 60 million acres of the northern Great Plains, 60 million acres larger than the entire state of Wyoming. And Article 12 added a lock on top of that promise. Any future change to that land required the written consent of 3/4 of all adult Lakota men. Not a majority. 3/4. Supermajority consent, written into law. The United States government agreed to all of it. Both treaties now existed. Paris in 1783, Fort Laramie in 1868. The question is, what happened to each one after the ink dried? The Treaty of Paris had something the Fort Laramie Treaty did not. The other party had a navy. Britain could enforce its terms with warships, trade leverage, and diplomatic consequence. Violating Paris carried a cost the United States could not easily absorb. Violating Fort Laramie carried a cost the United States chose not to pay. That is not an accident. That is a pattern. And the pattern has a specific starting point. July of 1874. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer led 1,200 men directly into treaty-protected Lakota territory. He brought soldiers, surveyors, a newspaper reporter from the New York Tribune, and a brass band. A brass band playing music into land the United States had legally promised to stay out of. The sound of horns and drums moved through pine valleys the Lakota considered sacred. The smell of expedition camp, wood smoke, horse sweat, gun oil, drifted across Lakota hunting ground. This was not a covert operation. It was theater. Custer's team found gold in the creek beds of the Black Hills in August 1874. He sent a dispatch east by courier, knowing exactly what would happen next. Within weeks, newspapers across the country screamed gold in the treaty-protected hills. Miners poured in hundreds, then thousands, directly violating the 1868 agreement. The U.S. government was legally obligated to stop them. Article 2 was unambiguous. The government did not stop them. It stopped trying to stop them. There is a critical distinction in those two sentences, and it is not subtle. The U.S. Army briefly attempted token enforcement, turning away a handful of miners here and there. But by mid-1875, federal officials were privately discussing how to acquire the Black Hills legally. The word legally in that sentence deserves its own moment. They knew the treaty existed. They knew Article 12 required Lakota consent. Their solution was not to honor the treaty. Their solution was to demand the land anyway. In December 1875, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum. All Lakota must report to reservations by January 31, 1876. That deadline midwinter on the northern plains was not a negotiation, it was a trap. Many Lakota could not travel in those conditions. Others refused to abandon treaty-protected land. Non-compliance was then used to justify military campaigns against the Lakota that same year. The Great Sioux War of 1876 followed. And then came 1877, 9 years after the treaty was signed. 9 years, shorter than a single U.S. Senate term. Congress passed the Act of February 28, 1877. In that act, Congress unilaterally seized the Black Hills from the Great Sioux Reservation. No consent of 3/4 of adult Lakota men was obtained. Article 12 was simply ignored. The U.S. government did not pretend the treaty did not exist. It knew the treaty existed. It chose to break it in writing, on official congressional paper, with a recorded vote. Compare that to Paris. Britain withdrew from American soil. Prisoners were exchanged. Terms were met. The same constitutional system. The same era. Two completely different outcomes. And the difference was not complexity or confusion. The difference was power specifically, who held it and who did not. Britain could retaliate. The Lakota, surrounded and undersupplied after the 1876 war, could not. But what came next, nobody teaches this part. Between 1877 and 1889, the Great Sioux Reservation was systematically dismantled. 60 million acres became 12 million acres across 5 fragmented reservations. 80% of the original land base gone in 12 years. To understand that scale, if your city lost 80% of its territory tomorrow, you would be left with one neighborhood. One neighborhood from what was once a major metropolitan area, spread across terrain larger than Wyoming. The 5 remaining reservations were not contiguous. They were fragments, separated by land now open to white settlement. The treaty infrastructure, the legal architecture, built in 1868, had been demolished brick by brick. And here is something the Paris comparison makes impossible to ignore. The U.S. did not cite emergency. It did not claim the Fort Laramie Treaty was flawed. It simply decided the Lakota's treaty was worth less than Britain's. No legal principle explains that difference. No constitutional clause authorized it. What explains it is a belief never written into law but acted upon constantly that some treaties were real and others were not. And then, in 1903, that belief was written into law. January 5, 1903, the Supreme Court of the United States. The case was called Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. The court's ruling was direct. Congress holds plenary power over tribal relations and can unilaterally break any treaty with any native nation, any time, any reason, without consent, without legal remedy. Without legal remedy meaning no native nation could go to court and win, no matter how clear the treaty language. Think about the mortgage on your home. Now imagine Congress passed a law saying your bank could take your house whenever it chose. Not because you missed a payment, but because mortgages with people like you specifically do not count. That is Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. That is what it did. It retroactively legalized every treaty violation already committed against every native nation. It pre-authorized every violation still to come. The Paris Treaty remained untouched international law, still binding, still enforceable in diplomatic and legal forums. But native treaties were now a different category of document entirely valid only as long as Congress chose to honor them. Scholar Vine Deloria Jr. called this ruling the Dred Scott decision of Indian law. Dred Scott had said Black Americans had no legal standing in federal court. Lone Wolf said the same about native treaty rights. Both rulings were judicial decisions. Both reflected choices, not inevitabilities. The Fort Laramie Treaty had been broken. Now, the breaking was legal. That is the sequence. And the legal architecture built around that sequence, that is what the Lakota have been fighting ever since. Let us return to the actual text of the 1868 treaty for a moment. Absolute and undisturbed use and occupation. Those words were written by U.S. commissioners, not by the Lakota, by the United States government. The government chose that language. Absolute, not partial, not conditional. Absolute. The government also chose undisturbed, not mostly undisturbed, not undisturbed pending congressional review, undisturbed. Custer's brass band played into that undisturbed territory 6 years later. The sound of it, the specific, deliberate sound of a military band in a place it had legally promised not to enter, is worth sitting with. It was not a mistake. It was a signal. The signal said, "The words we wrote do not apply the way you think they do." Compare that to the Treaty of Paris, Article 1. Britain acknowledged American independence and then actually withdrew from American territory. No troops remained on American soil in violation of the treaty. No British flag flew over American land. The words meant what they said. With the Fort Laramie Treaty, the words meant what was convenient to enforce, which turned out to be very little. Now, here is the part that is still unresolved. June 30th, 1980. The Supreme Court of the United States, the same court that had ruled against native treaty rights in 1903, ruled on the Black Hills. The case was United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians. The court ruled 8-1. The 1877 seizure of the Black Hills was an unconstitutional taking. Justice Harry Blackmun, writing for the majority, used a word rarely seen in Supreme Court opinions. He called the U.S. government's actions dishonorable. Dishonorable. From the Supreme Court. That is not a technical legal term. That is a moral judgment written into the official record of the United States judiciary. The court awarded $102 million in compensation principal plus interest. The Lakota refused it. Not out of poverty. Not out of confusion. Out of principle. Accepting the money would legally extinguish their land claim to Paha Sapa, the Black Hills. Once you take the money, the land is legally sold. The Lakota understood that. The Oglala Sioux tribal president at the time made it plain. The land was not for sale. The money has sat in a federal account for over 40 years, untouched, accumulating interest. As of recent years, that fund has grown to more than $1.3 billion refused. $1.3 billion more than the annual education budget of many U.S. states sitting in a federal account because the Lakota are not selling. The Treaty of Paris required no such resistance. Its terms were honored. There was no uncollected fund. There was no need for one. The comparison Paris honored, Fort Laramie refused, is not a coincidence of history. It is the policy of selective treaty enforcement made visible in two parallel lines. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. In 1871, 3 years after Fort Laramie was signed, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act. That law declared no native nation would ever again be recognized as an independent power capable of making treaties. The treaty era was over-ended not because it failed, but because it was no longer useful. Existing treaties were nominally preserved, but made immediately vulnerable to congressional override. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had been signed 3 years earlier. It was now orphaned. The U.S. could still honor it. Congress chose not to. Between 1778 and 1871, the United States negotiated approximately 370 treaties with native nations, 370 more agreements than the U.S. has signed with all of Europe, Asia, and Latin America combined in its entire diplomatic history. Every single one was violated, abrogated, or reinterpreted to native nations' disadvantage. 370 treaties, 0 fully honored. That is the pattern. And it was built deliberately. That number comes from historian Vine Deloria Jr., whose landmark work, Behind the Trail of Broken Treaties, documented the pattern in legal detail. Now compare the treaty record with European powers. The Jay Treaty of 1794 with Britain honored. The Convention of Mortefontaine with France in 1800 honored. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 honored. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 honored. The pattern is not that the United States broke treaties. The pattern is which treaties the United States broke. International agreements with foreign powers who could respond with economic and military consequence honored. Domestic agreements with native nations who had been stripped of military capacity broken. The variable is not the quality of the promise. The variable is the consequence of breaking it. Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota leader who negotiated the very treaties that were then violated, put it simply. In words preserved in multiple historical accounts, including James Olson's Red Cloud and the Sioux Problem, they promised to take our land, and they took it. That is the full sentence. Nothing complicated about it. Red Cloud lived through the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, and the seizure of the Black Hills. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was reciting a documented history from his own life. The Paris Treaty had no equivalent quote from the British side, because there was nothing to complain about. The treaty worked. The Lakota Treaty did not work, because it was not allowed to. Now look at what was lost in concrete terms. 60 million acres in 1868, 12 million acres by 1889. That is 80% of the original land base, gone in 21 years through a series of acts Congress passed without Lakota consent. The land that remained was divided into 5 fragmented reservations, separated by territory now open to homesteaders. The Black Hills Pahasapa sat at the center of what had been taken, now dotted with mining operations, and eventually carved with 4 presidential faces. The faces on Mount Rushmore look out from land the Supreme Court of the United States later called an unconstitutional taking. That fact has not changed. The monument remains, the ruling remains, the uncollected $1.3 billion remains. This is not ancient history. This is an unresolved legal dispute in the United States right now. The Lakota Great Sioux Nation has not accepted the judgment. The land claim is still active. And in courts across the country, the question of what treaty promises mean in the 21st century is still being argued. The Paris Treaty does not require that kind of ongoing fight. It was honored once and stayed honored. That is the difference in one sentence. One treaty was honored because violating it had consequences. One was broken because breaking it did not. And then a law was passed to make sure breaking it would never face consequences again. Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock in 1903 did not just affect the Fort Laramie Treaty. It reached backward through all 370 treaties and retroactively authorized every violation of every one. It reached forward and pre-authorized every violation still to come. It is still active precedent. It has never been overturned. As of today, the United States government legally retains the power to break any treaty it has ever made with any native nation. No court can stop it. No vote is required. No consent is needed. The Treaty of Paris has no equivalent vulnerability. International treaty law protects it differently. 2 treaties, same government, one protected by international law, one unprotected by design. That design did not happen by accident. It was built, case by case, act by act, ruling by ruling. Now look at how this was made to feel inevitable, because that is the last piece of the architecture. When the U.S. violated the Paris Treaty, it would have been an international incident, reported in European capitals, affecting trade. When the U.S. violated Fort Laramie, the New York Tribune ran stories about gold. The press was not covering the treaty violation, it was advertising the reason for it. The public narrative was gold rush, Western expansion, manifest destiny not. We broke our written promise to the Lakota. The word manifest destiny did a great deal of work in this period. It made violations sound like geography. It made the seizure of Pahasapa sound like something that simply happened rather than something that was chosen. But choices leave evidence, and the evidence here is the 1877 Congressional Act specific, dated, recorded. A choice was made. The Black Hills would be taken. Article 12 would be ignored. And it was. Names on a roll call. Men who knew what Article 12 said and voted to override it anyway. That is the texture of what treaty violation actually means at the ground level. Not a vague historical failure, but votes cast and papers signed. And on the other side, Lakota leaders reading the record, watching the land shrink on maps that they did not draw and had not agreed to. Maps redrawn in Washington, borders moved in ink, 60 million acres becoming 12 million while the treaty language stayed unchanged. Absolute and undisturbed use and occupation still printed in the document, still in the National Archives, still unenforced. And the Lakota knew it was unenforced. That knowledge, the specific weight of watching a written promise dissolve in real time, is in the historical record. Red Cloud lived through it. Spotted Tail lived through it. Their words are in the historical accounts. They were not confused about what happened. They were watching a government choose, repeatedly and deliberately, not to honor its written word. That is different from incompetence. That is different from bureaucratic error. That is a policy pursued across administrations, across decades, with legal architecture built specifically to support it. The Treaty of Paris did not need that architecture because nobody was trying to break it. Fort Laramie needed to be broken, so the architecture was built to break it. Lone Wolf in 1903 was not the beginning of that architecture. It was the capstone. The foundation was laid in the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871. The walls were built in 1877. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead. July 9, 2020, the Supreme Court of the United States issued a ruling in McGirt v. Oklahoma. The case involved the Muskogee Nation and whether 19th-century treaty promises made to them remained legally valid. The court ruled 5-4 that they did. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority, affirmed that approximately 3 million acres in eastern Oklahoma remain Muskogee Nation reservation land. 3 million acres. Because Congress had never explicitly disestablished the reservation, the treaty language still held. McGirt shows that treaty enforcement is not a closed question. It is a live legal question with real consequences today. And it shows something the Paris versus Fort Laramie comparison makes even sharper. Treaties survive when courts are willing to read them as they were written. The Fort Laramie Treaty's Article 2 was written clearly. The Supreme Court in 1980 agreed it was violated. But the remedy offered money was refused because the Lakota read the treaty too. And the treaty says land, not money. The $1.3 billion in that federal account is not a settlement. It is an open question. It is the United States government saying, here is what we owe you. It is the Lakota saying, what you owe us cannot be bought. That exchange has been happening for over 40 years, in silence, in a federal account nobody discusses in history class. The Paris Treaty requires no such accounting. That chapter was closed cleanly, because both parties met their obligations. The Fort Laramie chapter has not been closed. The Lakota have not allowed it to be closed. Every year the money sits uncollected. It is a legal act of resistance. It says, we have not agreed. We have not sold. The treaty is still ours. The land is still in dispute. That is not grief. That is litigation. Active, deliberate, principled litigation, conducted across generations. The Lakota did not forget the treaty language. They remember Article 2 precisely. They remember Article 12 precisely. They remember because the document is in the National Archives, and because it describes land their families still live near. 1783, Britain signed the Paris Treaty. Britain withdrew. The U.S. honored its terms. The matter was settled. 1868, the U.S. signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota. 6 years later, Custer rode in with a brass band. 9 years later, Congress seized the Black Hills. 12 years later, 80% of the reservation was gone. 112 years later, the Supreme Court called it dishonorable. 156 years later, the money is still sitting in a federal account, uncollected. The Paris Treaty is 241 years old and fully resolved. The Fort Laramie Treaty is 156 years old and still open, not because the Lakota lost, because they are still standing in the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Standing there in courtrooms, in tribal councils, in the quiet refusal of $1 billion check. 9 years later, Congress seized the Black Hills. 12 years later, 80% of the reservation was gone. 112 years later, the Supreme Court called it dishonorable. 156 years later, the money is still sitting in a federal account, uncollected. The Paris Treaty is 241 years old and fully resolved. The Fort Laramie